This morning we're continuing our conversation on the practice of liberating love through the practice of story, right? What is it about story that is important to our faith and how we live our lives? Last week we talked about creation. Today I want to talk about the actual practice of telling our stories. And telling our stories not just because we're making chit-chat or, sitting around needing something to fill the space, but telling our stories as a sacred practice. Telling our stories as part of how we understand who we are and how we share that in the world. And on the flip side is not just the telling of the stories, but also the listening to the stories, and how listening itself can be a sacred practice. So there has been a lot of research in neuroscience about storytelling. Might come as a little bit of a surprise. You think stories are kind of more softer science than hard science per se. But there have been a number of science research based around storytelling, particularly when it comes to hard stories, right? Stories that maybe have a little bit of trauma attached to them. One of my favorite books when looking at telling stories as a sacred practice and as a healing practice is called The Book of Forgiving. It was written by Archbishop Desmond Tutu and his daughter Mpho Tutu. And he actually talks about this science of storytelling in there. And he makes 2 points that I'd like to share. The first is he talks about, and he says, neuroscientists tell us that there are 2 kinds of memories: explicit and implicit. When we remember an event and we know what happened, we form explicit memories. We know explicitly that we are remembering something. When we experience an event and we are not consciously aware of, we form implicit memories. In other words, we don't realize we are remembering something. I'm going to pause before I go on to his second piece, because Bessel van der Kolk also talks about this in The Body Keeps the Score, right, which is how our body holds on to trauma. And he says one of the biggest parts that determines whether or not something will become a traumatic event for a person is if they can tell the story of what has happened to them. Right? Trauma actually impacts the parts of our brain that allows us to verbalize our stories, that allows us to talk about what has happened to us. So the sooner after we have something happen, a traumatic event or even a happy event, the sooner we're able to talk about it and to start turning it into a story, the better we're able to deal with it, to process it, to incorporate what it means to who we are and how we live in this life. And Desmond Tutu actually confirms this part of it as well, and he goes on to say, when we know our stories and make sense of what has happened, we get connected to the larger story of our lives and its meaning. We become more resilient. We're able to better handle stress, and we heal. He says neuropsychiatrist Dan Siegel explains that the best predictor of how well a child will attach to his or her parents and have positive, loving relationships is whether the parents had a clear and coherent story about their lives and the traumas they have experienced. I don't know about you, but this is pretty mind-blowing to me. Right? I love stories. I love reading them with you all. I love reading them to my kids. I love listening to them and occasionally even telling my own. But I did not realize that my draw towards story also has this really incredible research backing up the importance of story to our neurology and to our sense of self and making meaning in the world. In my few moments of downtime lately, I've gone back to one of my favorite relaxing things to watch. How many of you have ever seen Queer Eye? A couple. I see some smiles, but not hands in the back. Queer Eye is a TV show. It used to be called Queer Eye for the Straight Guy, but they've become more inclusive, which is lovely. Queer Eye is a show where they bring 5 gay men and non-binary gendered people who are experts in various areas of getting your life together. They bring them into someone's life who's been struggling, and they help them to change about who they are and to become more of their true self. And a huge part of this process is that person who they're working with to try and improve their lives, them telling their story. And many times the person who they're trying to work with has been through something traumatic and has never had a chance to process it. And you can see in the week that they spend with each of these individuals the difference in the way they hold themselves, the way they talk about their understanding of their lives, partially because they get really nice places to live and nice clothes and nice new hair. That's part of it. But the more important part is their chance to tell their stories. A chance to have people come into their lives who care about them authentically and take the time to hold sacred space for the telling and the listening of story. It's a powerful thing. Where in our lives do we make time to tell our stories? I see Roger over here shaking his head. No, me too. Right? It's not something at the top of our list these days. It used to be a communal practice, right? You'd gather around the fire and we'd tell the stories of the community. Sometimes we'd have a practice with kids of telling stories around the dinner table. But many of us have lost that practice. I try and do it when I'm getting my Lenny, my 6-year-old, to sleep at night. I try to occasionally add in a story of our family. But it's not something we usually carve out time for. Right? Our capitalist world says, well, if you need to tell your story, then you can pay to go to a psychologist or a counselor and they will listen for you. And don't get me wrong, that is a very valuable service, especially when you're trying to work through trauma stories. I have my own therapist, and it's a valuable thing in my life I would not give away by any means. And one of the purposes of religious community has occasionally been a place to tell and hold our stories. So this morning, rather than me continuing to talk on and on, I'd like to make space for us to practice that here today. So start getting into that place of your own stories. What stories have meaning for who you are in your life? And I'm going to share one story with you and then extend the invitation for each of you to share with one another. So Bruce, if you'd give me a minute of music while I get set up. All right. Let's see if we've got sound. We've got sound. Woo! So this is a story that actually Beth Stroopman contacted me and said, I love this story from my childhood. And I said, I love it too, even though I've never seen it before. Let's use it. So this is called Wilfred Gordon MacDonald Partridge. It's written by Mem Fox and illustrated by June Vivas. There once was a small boy called Wilfred Gordon MacDonald Partridge. And what's more, he wasn't very old either. His house was next door to an old people's home, and he knew all the people who lived there. He liked Mrs. Jordan, who played the organ. He listened to Mr. Hoskins, who told him scary stories. He played with Mr. Tippett, who was crazy about cricket. He ran errands for Miss Mitchell, who walked with a wooden stick. He admired Mr. Drysdale, who had a voice like a giant. But his favorite person of all was Miss Nancy Alice Delacourt Cooper, because she had 4 names just like he did. He called her Miss Nancy and told her all his secrets. One day, Wilfred Gordon heard his mother and father talking about Miss Nancy. Poor old thing, his mother said. Why is she a poor old thing? Asked Wilfred Gordon. Because she's lost her memory, said his father. It isn't surprising, said his mother. After all, she is 96. What's a memory? Asked Wilfred Gordon. He was always asking questions. It's something you remember, said his father. But Wilfred Gordon wanted to know more. So he called on Mrs. Jordan, who played the organ. What's a memory? He asked. Something warm, my child. Something warm. He called on Mr. Hosking, who told him scary stories. What's a memory? He said. Something from long ago, my lad. Something from long ago. He called on Mr. Tippett, who was crazy about cricket. What's a memory? He asked. Something that makes you cry, my boy. Something that makes you cry. He called on Miss Mitchell, who walked with a wooden stick. What's a memory? He asked. Something that makes you laugh, my darling. Something that makes you laugh. He called on Mr. Drysdale, who had a voice like a giant. What's a memory? He asked. something as precious as gold, young man. Something as precious as gold. So, Wilfred Gordon went home to look for memories for Miss Nancy because she had lost her own. He found a puppet on a string, kind of like this one, which always made everyone laugh. And he put that in the basket. And I went out of order. Sorry, Katie. This puppet happens to be from Taiwan, from my first trip there with Eric when we were dating. He looked for a shoebox of shells he had found long ago last summer and put them in a basket. Shells like these that I found when I was a kid at the beach. He remembered with sadness the medal which his grandfather had given him, and he placed it gently next to the shells. I don't have a medal, but I've got a trophy here. Next, he found a football, which was as precious as gold. We don't really do sports as much in my family, but we have a rainbow ball, which is precious because it reminds us of the beauty of each of us and how different we are, and the rainbow flag. And last of all, on his way to Miss Nancy's, he went into the hen house and took a fresh, warm egg from under the hen. I took this one warm this morning out of the boiling water so that I wouldn't have trouble if I broke it on the way in. Then Wilfred Gordon called on Miss Nancy and gave her each thing one by one. What a dear, strange child to bring me all these wonderful things, thought Miss Nancy. Then she started to remember. She held the warm egg and told Wilfred Gordon about the tiny speckled blue eggs she had once found in a bird's nest in her aunt's garden. She put a shell to her ear and remembered going to the beach by tram long ago and how hot she had felt in her button-up boots. So hot they had to come off. She touched the medal and talked sadly of the big brother she had loved who had gone to war and never returned. She smiled at the puppet on strings. She remembered the one she had shown to her sister and how she had laughed with a mouth full of porridge. Felix definitely laughs when Lenny plays with this one. She bounced the football to Wilfred Gordon and remembered the day she had met him and the secrets they had told. And the two of them smiled and smiled because Miss Nancy's memories had been found again by a small boy who wasn't very old either.